Hello and welcome to the most underrated cards in Premodern. We're going to start by looking at the ones that are often suggested but aren't good, then the ones that are good but not played enough, and finally we'll look at the ones that are definitely good. So of the ones that people often suggest that are not good, the one that always comes to my mind is Spy Network. I've had plenty of people suggest this over the years and it's just absolutely terrible. It doesn't replace itself, which means it's just one mana, you go down a card and it just does nothing to the board. Yes, you do get information, but there are a lot of situations where this information doesn't actually change what you would do anyway, and it's just really not worth going down a card for. And another one that I think is a massive trap is Seed Time. For one, I think it's just not that good at doing what you want it to do. If you want to push through a card, then definitely you would choose something like Orim's Chant, Abeyance, or Mana Short, as those can actually stop your thing from getting countered and let you force it through, whereas Seed Time is more reactive. You play your card and then they do something and you respond with Seed Time. The upside is you take another turn, which sometimes isn't really that much of an upside because you don't have any board presence. They've still got loads of untapped lands and cards in hand. But the downside is you just have a card that you straight up cannot cast because they haven't played a blue spell. So I really think that this one is a big trap. And moving on to cards that are played, but I just think could be played more. The first one is True Believer. This one does see play. A lot of people don't realise it actually stops Oath of Druids because Oath of Druids is a target effect. And that's one of the reasons that I think True Believer could definitely see more play in some of those white-based builds. And another one, Skeletal Scrying. This is just an absolute powerhouse for drawing loads of cards. It is seeing more and more play over time as people realise how good it is, but I think it could definitely go into a lot more decks than it is in right now. Cursed Totem stops so many things and it's colourless. It really should see more play than it does. It stops all creature activated abilities, including mana abilities, which stops so many different creature combos. It stops the Replenish deck's infinite combos, as Opalescence turns the enchantments into creatures, meaning they can't use their abilities anymore. It's colourless and I really feel it just should see a lot more play than it does. And Unnerried Brushhopper is gaining popularity this year, and it really deserves it because it's an incredibly strong card. It's very good against creatures and can profitably kill a Call of the Herd, but it's almost impossible to remove if your opponent doesn't want you to kill it. All around very strong card that definitely deserves to see more play than it currently does. And Cabal Interrogator is another one that's becoming much more popular this year. Discard on a stick is just really strong in certain matchups and can just completely take over. This card can even take lands out of opponents' hands, so it's just really powerful and it's good to see that it's getting more play. And another one that's really come onto the radar this year is Flash of Insight. It looks like a bad draft card when you first see it, but actually it's very good in the right matchups. You want to use it as a 3-mana draw card or maybe just even like a bad impulse. Obviously over the game that front side gets much more powerful as the game goes longer, but it's really the flashback part that makes it super powerful, as in a heavy blue deck you can flash it back for 5, 7, 9 and it almost becomes like a tutor effect and it gives you a lot of card advantage. So I do feel that the heavy blue decks or mono blue decks such as Stasis or maybe even Landstill could definitely try to play 1 or 2 of these and just see how it goes, because it is actually much more powerful than it looks. And moving into some solid sleeper cards, starting off with the maybes. And we're going to start with Grand Colosseum. A lot of people do complain about the enemy color mana bases in the format, and this card has seen play in the past, particularly in solution builds or other 3-color builds, so I do feel it could see some play there. You also have these, but they're obviously just nowhere near as good as Grand Colosseum, and while yes they do come into play tapped, it's not as good as City of Brass or the other Pain lands. If the mana base is really that bad, then I definitely think these are playable. And Scalding Tongs is a maybe because some decks could definitely use it to punch through that last bit of damage to control decks, although I do have to say I think Curse Scroll is probably better in almost every situation, that's why it's a maybe. And Flowstone Flood's effect is absolutely devastating. Against some decks, destroying a land every single turn is just absolutely game over, even if you are discarding a card at random and losing 3 life every time. Impending Disaster is a similar thing. It's a 2-mana Armageddon that you can get in under counter magic, and it can just sit there, and if they don't have a disenchant effect, It either means they can't play any more lands, or you can play more lands to blow up all the lands. I definitely think it's worth testing because in certain matchups that effect is very strong. And Converge Witches has some of my favourite art in the whole game, but it also has a really good effect being able to ping things for 1. That's incredibly strong against weenie decks such as Elves, as well as many other decks, and it comes down on turn 2, which is a turn earlier than Plague Spitter. It may not be better, but I definitely want to include it in this maybe section because I do think it's a decent card. Strong Arm Tactics is a very interesting card. I definitely don't think it's good in every matchup, but against certain control decks, where you can play this as your last card in hand, not discarding anything, you don't care about losing life, but them discarding a card and taking 4 damage is really quite a big deal. Plus, it gives black a way to actually punch damage through without attacking. So I really think this is an interesting card that I do want to try out at some point in my mono black sideboards. Integrity is clearly a very strong effect against green decks. This can let you draw a bunch of cards. The main thing is whether it's better than things like Hibernation or cards from other colours, but it's definitely a very, very strong effect. And speaking of strong effects, False Memories is incredibly powerful, putting 7 cards into your graveyard. This really feels like a kind of tutor for reanimation decks, or anything that really needs a specific card in the graveyard. I'm not actually sure how good it is, but the fact you can do it end of turn and then untap with your mana before removing stuff definitely makes this one that I really want to try out. Bone Dancer has really cool art, but it also has an incredibly good ability. Being able to put the top creature card of an opponent's graveyard into play when it deals combat damage as a kind of replacement effect is incredibly strong in those grindy matchups. Plus, it also has the relevant creature type of zombie. Maybe zombies could play this, but I think it's really at home in those control-ish decks that can sweep the board of creatures and then get in with this to take one of their opponents, putting them really far ahead. Destructive Flow is an incredibly powerful effect and is just game over in certain matchups. I have seen decks built around it and I really feel we should see more of those, just based off how strong of a card it is and how cool it is to play. Ether Flash can absolutely lock weenie decks out of the game, but the main problem it has here is which deck you would put it in, because it doesn't really have a solid home. The mono red control deck is already very good against creatures, but I think if we can find a home for this card, it's just very strong against small creature decks. And the next one is Keldron Outpost, which has a really strong ability. It does have some downsides and is particularly weak to Wasteland, but based on how powerful it is, I really do think it could probably see some more play somewhere, either in some control builds, or maybe at least as a one-of in White Weenie or something like that. I've grouped the next 3 cards together, not only because they have similar abilities, but also because there isn't really a deck for any of them to go into. I definitely really like Orcish Lumberjack. Being able to accelerate to 5 mana on turn 2 is really a lot, and it really makes me feel there must be a green-red deck somewhere that could play this and really abuse it. Lake of the Dead is much weaker because it's very weak to Wasteland, but it's still an incredibly powerful card. I'm just not sure what you'd be ramping out with it. And Raphaelos is a great card, but it's actually just slower than Priest of Titania, because you can only play 1 forest per turn, but in Elves, you can just ramp out loads of Elves and then Priest taps for loads of mana. So that's why I think Raphaelos is the one that I'm the least excited about here. And so Pursuit of Knowledge is obviously not an incredibly interesting card by itself, although there are some niche situations where it might actually be very useful, particularly long drawn out games where they struggle to remove it and you don't need cards now, or something like Pit Rack maybe. But it really shines with specifically Sylvan Library, where you can use those draws to power up the Pursuit, effectively turning it into a 4 mana draw 7. And I do think that those decks, they might somehow be able to abuse it. I'm not fully sure, but it's definitely something that I'd be interested to try in certain scenarios. And Primal Order is a kind of green, Price of Progress, Sulfuric Vortex kind of card. It shoots each player for 1 for every non-basic land that they have in play in their upkeep. Now, I'm not sure which decks would want this. Perhaps elves might want this in those matchups where they control the board, they destroy all the creatures, and then you can just play a Primal Order, and even if you're just shooting for 3 a turn, that's still a really fast clock, and it just demands an answer. Most of these control decks, they do have 3 or more non-basic lands in play by the mid-game, so I do definitely think it's a very interesting card that I really want to try out. And moving on to the cards that I'm certain are good, Oath of Ghouls. This isn't for every matchup, but if you're playing a creature deck and you're playing against a control deck, this is effectively return a creature card from your graveyard to your hand every upkeep, which is a very strong effect for 2 mana, and I really think it could definitely see more play in sideboards for fighting some of those control decks. A huge shout out to Casey Gregor for showing me this one. This card is absolutely incredible against the mono blue decks such as Tide Control, Stasis or Stiflenaught. It causes a loss of life, which means it does get around things like Circle of Protection, but I think this card is much more proactive than something like a Red Blast, so I'd really like to try it out. Obviously the variance on this is really big, as it could be absolutely amazing or do nothing, but I think even if you just hit them with 2 cards in their hand, then that's still a huge swing in the game, and I think it's enough that I want to try it out. And another one that I really like as a 1 of or 2 of in the sideboard is Eradicate. It's extremely good against the decks that go big instead of wide, so that would be Terravor, Phyrexian Dreadnought, Exalted Angel for example, where the decks put a lot of time and effort into getting one very big threat. If you can remove all of their combo piece, such as a Dreadnought or maybe even a Hermit Druid, often those decks really struggle to get back in the game, and that's why I really like Eradicate. And talking of Eradicate, I really think Scour is really underplayed. There are so many enchantment-based decks at the moment, and being able to take all of their key enchantments is just absolutely huge. If you can hit an Opalescence, a Parallax Tide or Wave, an Oath of Druids or something else with this, then it can just absolutely devastate their game plan and even make it impossible for them to win in certain matchups and certain deck types. And another community favourite is Envelop. It counters a lot of key cards right now, such as Replenish, Discard, Burning Wish, and just a bunch of other random combo pieces. I don't think it counters enough for me to want to play 4 in a sideboard, but I can definitely see playing 1 or 2 somewhere, and it is a definitely playable card. Okay, so Rejuvenation Chamber is really good against Sly. It's okay against other aggro decks, but especially Sly that trades cards in the form of burn spells for damage. The Chamber gains us 8 life, albeit over several turns. 2, then 2, then 2, and then in response before you sack it, another 2. I really think this card can go in a bunch of decks that don't have good answers for Sly. Fire Covenant is absolutely brutal. It's a 3 mana instant speed one-sided Wrath of God, and the only reason we don't see more of it is because there aren't so many red-black decks. But there are a lot of multicolor decks, especially like 5-color aggro decks or combo decks, that could definitely support playing this in the sideboard, and I really think they should, based off how insanely powerful it can be. And so Gloom is the next one. It's a really good way to fight Replenish. Not only does it make all of their white spells cost 3 mana more, which is really good, as we know from Chill against mono red decks, but it also makes their white enchantments, which are some of the most dangerous ones, cost 3 mana to activate. That means Parallax Wave is 7 to cast and 3 to activate, and Seal of Cleansing is 5 to cast and 3 to activate, which is really brutal against this deck. It also has the additional splash damage of being very good against the white weenie based decks, which are also very good. Very underplayed card, and yeah, definitely just needs to see more play. And the next one is Dwarven Miner. You know, so many decks in this format really over-rely on their non-basic lands, whether it's either for fixing or as a manland package or denial package in Richland Port. If you can play this guy on turn 2 and start nuking their lands every turn, very few control or mid-range decks can beat that, and it's just a very solid card all around. Okay guys, so this next one has actually already gone mainstream, or is definitely just starting to. It takes me several weeks to make this video, and I started making it a while ago. In that time, there was a huge tournament, and the winner actually had 2 of these in his list. Tempting Worm as a 2-mana 5/5 is just absolutely brutal, and it does have a very significant drawback, but it's rarely played as a 2-drop. Usually you would wait until later in the game where the opponent has used all of their resources, and then you would just drop a huge 5/5 where they won't have many cards in hand, and there's not really too much that they can do with that drawback. A lot of the survival decks are playing 2 of these, where, if you can just play both in the same turn and get 10 power in play, that can really change the course of a game and absolutely start to take over, where very few things can deal with this. So it's really good to see this card starting to get some of the recognition that it deserves. And so Blood Moon is a card that doesn't really need an introduction. It's super powerful against non-basic lands. So many of the decks in this format really over-rely on non-basic lands. There's so many decks that play loads of colors, play loads of man lands, play loads of denial lands such as Rishton Ports and Wastelands, and really rely heavily on those. I really think Blood Moon is just a prime card for this format and definitely deserves to see more play than it does. Divert is also a super strong one that definitely deserves to see more play. Changing the target of something for 1 mana is really strong, especially in a format where usually the opponent won't have 2 mana to actually pay for it. You can change so many things. You can change the Ponza deck's land destruction back to destroy their own lands. You can change the burn deck's burn to kill their creatures. You can change counter spells to counter the misdirection. It's just really good for just 1 mana and definitely needs to see more play. Okay guys, so Mage's Contest is my own spicy tech that I've been using for a while. I've actually won loads of games with it because no one expects a red counterspell. It has a lot of text, but effectively the majority of the time it just reads counter target spell, lose 1 life, which from red is really strong. Against Replenish, just counter their Replenish, and they're not expecting it, and usually that's enough to win the game. Similarly, against other combo decks, you can counter their combo piece. No one expects a red counterspell. Against some opponents, they're not really sure how to play against it because it is a very unusual card, and they will actually try to bid life, in which case, because you're the red deck, you'll almost always be on a higher life total, and you can either just bid loads of life and then counter the spell, or you can just keep bidding up and up, and when they get within burn range, you can just say, okay, you win, take the damage, now I burn you out, you lose. This card is incredibly strong in the sideboard of red decks, and it's a really good way to answer combo decks. Hidden Gibbons is a 1 mana 4/4. It doesn't become a 4/4 until our opponent plays an instant, but so many of the decks are just jammed full of instants that if you bring this in from the sideboard against one of those decks, it's basically a 1 mana 4/4. Against Sly, against the vast majority of the blue decks, it's basically a 1 mana 4/4, which is incredibly strong. In a similar way to how Tempting Worm is really efficient and really big, I really like this card and think it's really underplayed. So guys, if I had to choose my favorite, most underplayed cards, it would be these. Obviously, as I made the video way before I recorded the audio, Tempting Worm would definitely be number 1 now, especially as it just topped a major big tournament. But, it is what it is. I definitely think there's a lot of cards in this video that I would like to try out. If there's anything I missed, please do let me know. Otherwise, thank you for watching and see you next time.